What's up, everyone? I really got to apologize for ghosting you all and not dropping any stories lately. I've been thinking things over, and I decided to change things up with my channel. Moving forward, I'm not just going to share stories. I'm also going to get into my takes and thoughts on cheating, relationship problems, and getting even. We've all been there, been betrayed, cheated on, or watched someone we love walk out on us for somebody else. And when that goes down, wanting revenge is totally understandable. But like one of my awesome subscribers put it, the best revenge is living your best life. Anyway, guys, I know I'm talking your ear off here, so let's jump into today's story. What would you do if you discovered that the two people you trusted most in the world had been betraying you for months? Would you scream? Would you cry? Would you throw things and demand answers? Mark Henderson did none of those things. On the night of September 14th, in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, Mark made a discovery that should have destroyed him. Instead, it transformed him into something far more dangerous than a broken husband. It turned him into an architect of destruction. The house was silent when Mark came home 3 hours earlier than expected. His flight from Chicago had been rescheduled due to mechanical issues, and rather than waiting at the airport, he had grabbed the last seat on an earlier departure. He did not call Carol to tell her. He wanted to surprise her, maybe take her out to that Italian restaurant she loved, the one with the candles and the violin player who always made her laugh. He found her asleep on the couch with the television murmuring some reality show she never actually watched. Her phone sat on the coffee table, face up, and as Mark set down his briefcase, the screen illuminated with an incoming message. The name at the top made him pause. David, his best friend since freshman year of college, the man who had been his best man at their wedding 16 years ago. Mark told himself it was nothing. David and Carol were friends too. They all went to barbecues together, took vacations together, celebrated holidays together. There was nothing unusual about a text message. But something made him look closer. Something made him pick up that phone and read the words that would change everything. The message said, "I cannot stop thinking about last Tuesday. When can I see you again? I need you." Mark's hand did not tremble. His breath did not catch. He felt something cold settle into his chest, like a stone dropping into still water. He scrolled up through the conversation, reading message after message, each one more explicit than the last. Declarations of love, descriptions of encounters, plans for future meetings. The affair had been going on for at least 8 months, according to the timestamps. Carol stirred on the couch, and Mark set the phone down exactly where he had found it. He stood there for a long moment, watching his wife sleep, watching the woman he had built a life with, the mother of his 2 children. She looked peaceful. She looked innocent. She looked like a stranger. Most men would have woken her up. Most men would have demanded explanations, hurled accusations, shattered the quiet of that suburban night with rage and grief. Mark did something different. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the table in the darkness. He thought about David, about the rounds of golf, the football games watched together, the secrets shared over beers. He thought about Carol, about the lies she must have told, the excuses she must have invented, the kisses she gave him after spending afternoons in another man's arms. And then Mark began to plan. He returned to the living room and took photographs of every message on Carol's phone. He was methodical, careful, ensuring he captured dates and times. When he finished, he placed the phone back on the table, picked up his briefcase, and quietly climbed the stairs. He checked on his children, 12-year-old Emma and 9-year-old Lucas, sleeping peacefully in their rooms. He watched them for a long time. When Carol came to bed an hour later, Mark pretended to be asleep. She kissed his forehead and whispered that she was glad he was home. He said nothing. He lay in the darkness beside her, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, and he felt the last pieces of his old self crumble away. The man who had loved her unconditionally was gone. In his place was someone new, someone patient, someone capable of waiting as long as necessary to deliver a reckoning that neither Carol nor David would ever see coming. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who has completely fooled you? Have you ever shared a meal with a person whose smile hides a calculation so cold it would freeze your blood? For the next 3 months, Mark Henderson lived behind a mask so perfect that neither his wife nor his best friend suspected anything. He laughed at David's jokes. He made love to Carol. He played the role of happy husband and loyal friend while quietly gathering the ammunition for their destruction. The morning after his discovery, Mark woke Carol with breakfast in bed. Pancakes, fresh strawberries, the expensive maple syrup she liked. She looked at him with surprise and something that might have been guilt, and she told him he was too good to her. Mark smiled and said she deserved it. He watched her eat, studying her face, cataloging every micro-expression, learning the subtle tells of her deception. Over the following weeks, Mark paid attention to everything. He noticed how Carol always put her phone face down now. He noticed how she had new lingerie hidden in the back of her drawer, pieces he had never seen. He noticed how she mentioned David's name less often, as if consciously avoiding the subject. Each observation added another brick to the wall of evidence he was building. But Mark needed more than evidence of an affair. He needed leverage. He needed weapons. And David, it turned out, had provided plenty of them. David worked as a portfolio manager at a mid-sized investment firm downtown. He made good money, drove a nice car, lived in a beautiful house. But Mark had always wondered how David afforded certain things: trips to Europe, the boat, the renovations that never seemed to end. Now, with new eyes, Mark began asking careful questions during their golf games and poker nights. David loved to talk about his work. He loved to hint at his cleverness, his ability to move money in ways that maximized returns. After a few drinks, he would brag about knowing things before they became public, about having friends in the right places. Mark listened and remembered. He started researching securities law, insider trading regulations, the kinds of schemes that attracted federal attention. One evening, Mark invited David for beers at a sports bar downtown. He asked questions about a stock that had recently surged, a company David had recommended to several friends just weeks before a major acquisition announcement. David winked and said he had sources. Mark laughed and bought another round. That night, he went home and wrote down everything: names, dates, stock symbols, the amounts David had mentioned investing. Meanwhile, Mark began the delicate process of examining his own finances. He and Carol had joint accounts, savings built over years of careful planning. Mark started making small adjustments, moving money in ways that appeared routine. A transfer here for household expenses, a payment there for something he invented. Each transaction was designed to create a trail, a pattern that would eventually lead investigators directly to Carol. She noticed nothing. She was too busy scheduling her afternoons with David, too consumed with maintaining her own deceptions. Mark watched her lie to him about book clubs and gym sessions and coffee dates with girlfriends, and he filed away each falsehood like a card in a deck he would one day play. 3 months into his surveillance, Mark had compiled a comprehensive dossier. He had records of David's questionable trades going back 2 years. He had screenshots of the affair spanning nearly a year. He had financial records showing money movements that could easily be interpreted as criminal. The trap was almost ready. He just needed to find the right way to spring it. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one who is angry. It is the one who is patient. Mark Henderson had always been good at waiting. In business negotiations, in traffic, in the slow accumulation of career success. But he had never applied that patience to destruction before. Now he discovered he had a talent for it. Mark's college roommate, a man named Peter Chen, had gone on to build a successful cybersecurity consulting firm in Seattle. They had stayed in touch over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. In early January, Mark flew to Seattle under the pretense of exploring a business partnership. What he really wanted was education. Peter was happy to talk shop over expensive sushi and sake. Mark asked questions about digital privacy, about how information moved through systems, about the ways people could communicate without leaving traces. He framed his curiosity as concern for his company's data security. Peter, proud of his expertise, explained everything: encrypted email services, virtual private networks, the importance of physical separation between anonymous activities and regular life. Mark returned to Columbus with a new laptop purchased with cash in Seattle, a burner phone bought at a convenience store, and a detailed understanding of how to become invisible online. He set up an encrypted email account using a fake name. He practiced routing his connection through multiple servers until Peter's advice became second nature. He was building infrastructure for a campaign that his targets would never trace back to him. The financial piece required more delicacy. Mark needed Carol's fingerprints on dirty money without her knowledge or consent. He studied their accounts, their patterns, the ways financial institutions flagged suspicious activity. He consulted with their accountant about restructuring investments, asking innocent questions that gave him the information he needed. Over the next several weeks, Mark created a paper trail. He opened a new savings account in Carol's name, using her social security number and forging her signature, explaining to the bank that his wife was too busy to come in person. He transferred money in amounts just below reporting thresholds. He set up automatic transfers that appeared to come from shell companies connected to David's investment schemes. Each step was small, invisible, deniable. Together, they formed a noose. Carol remained oblivious. Her affair with David had apparently deepened, the messages on her phone growing more frequent and more reckless. Mark read them every few days, whenever she was in the shower or distracted with the children. He learned the schedule of their encounters, the hotel they preferred, the lies Carol told to create time for them. Part of Mark wondered if he should feel something. Rage, perhaps, or grief, or even jealousy. But those emotions seemed to belong to someone else now, someone he had been before September 14th. The man who loved Carol without reservation was dead. In his place was this new Mark, this patient architect of consequences, this husband who kissed his wife goodnight while planning the destruction of everything she cared about. Emma came to him one evening with a school project about families. She wanted to interview her parents about how they met, what they loved about each other, what made their marriage work. Mark sat with his daughter and told her the old stories, the ones about the coffee shop encounter and the first date at the zoo and the proposal on the beach at sunset. He watched Emma write down every word, her face glowing with the belief that her parents' love was something permanent and true. And he felt nothing at all. There are moments that divide time into before and after, moments so precise that everything leading up to them seems like preparation, and everything following seems like consequence. For David Mitchell, that moment came in a white envelope with no return address, delivered not to him, but to a field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Columbus, Ohio. Mark composed the letter over several days, refining each sentence until it was perfect. He wrote it on the laptop he had bought in Seattle, using the encrypted email setup to research exact details. He printed it at a public library 2 towns over, wearing gloves to avoid fingerprints. The paper was generic, the envelope unremarkable, the postmark from a small town 3 hours east, where Mark had stopped during a supposed business trip. The letter was addressed to the Financial Crimes Unit. It began with a simple statement: I have information about securities fraud being committed by David Mitchell of Hartwell Investment Group. What followed was a detailed accounting of insider trading patterns, specific stock purchases made days before public announcements, client funds redirected into personal accounts, and falsified documentation. Mark included account numbers, transaction dates, and the names of companies involved. Everything was accurate. Everything was verifiable. Everything pointed directly at David. Mark did not mention Carol in the letter. That connection would emerge on its own once investigators started digging. The money trails he had created would lead them straight to her accounts. She would look like an accomplice, a partner in her lover's crimes. The beauty of the plan was its invisibility. Mark would never be suspected because there was nothing connecting him to any of it. He mailed the letter on a cold Tuesday morning in February. The sky was gray and heavy with the threat of snow. Mark dropped the envelope in a blue mailbox outside a grocery store and walked away without looking back. He felt a strange calm, the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who has completed a difficult piece of work. Back home, life continued its performance of normalcy. Carol made dinner and asked about his day. The children did homework and argued over television shows. Mark played his part with practiced ease, the devoted husband, the engaged father, the unsuspecting friend. David came over that weekend for a Super Bowl party, and Mark handed him a beer and laughed at his jokes and felt the secret knowledge burning like a cold flame in his chest. The waiting began. Mark knew that federal investigations moved slowly, that agents would verify information before acting. He estimated it would take weeks, possibly months, before anything visible happened. In the meantime, he continued building his case against Carol. More transfers, more documentation, more carefully constructed evidence of her involvement in crimes she knew nothing about. He also began laying groundwork for what would come after. He researched divorce attorneys, custody laws, property division. He looked into the firm of Thomas Whitmore, a former federal prosecutor known for handling white-collar criminal defense. Mark met with Whitmore privately, explaining that he might need help with a delicate family matter in the future. He paid a substantial retainer, cash, establishing a relationship that would prove useful when the time came. Carol noticed that Mark seemed different somehow, more attentive, more present. She told her sister Linda that things felt better between them, that maybe the rough patch was ending. Mark overheard this phone conversation and added it to his mental file. Better, she thought things were getting better. She had no idea that the walls were closing in, that the trap was set, that her husband was counting down the days until her world would collapse. Patience is a weapon most people never learn to wield. They want immediate results, instant gratification, quick resolution. Mark Henderson had learned to wait 17 years earlier, during a hostile takeover attempt at his company that lasted 14 months. That experience taught him that time could be an ally if you knew how to use it. Now he was using it to dismantle 2 lives, and he was in no hurry at all. Spring arrived in Columbus with blooming magnolias and warming temperatures. Carol started a garden in the backyard, tomatoes and peppers and herbs she planned to use for summer cooking. Mark helped her build raised beds and turn soil, working beside her in the afternoon sun while their children played nearby. To anyone watching, they were a picture of suburban contentment, a family at ease with each other and the world. Only Mark knew what was coming. David had started acting strange. Mark noticed it first at their weekly golf game, a new tension in his friend's shoulders, a distraction in his eyes. When Mark asked if everything was all right, David laughed too quickly and said, "Work was stressful." The next week, David canceled golf entirely, claiming a client emergency. The week after that, Mark heard from another friend that David had been seen arguing with his business partner in the parking lot of their office building. The federal investigation was beginning to bite. Mark read the signs with quiet satisfaction. He knew that agents would have started with discreet inquiries, requests for documentation, interviews with employees. David's paranoia was growing, his carefully constructed facade showing cracks. Mark wondered if Carol had noticed anything during their clandestine meetings, if David had confided his fears to her. Carol gave no indication of concern. Her messages with David continued, though perhaps slightly less frequent. She still found time for their encounters, still lied to Mark about her whereabouts, still came home smelling of hotel soap with lies ready on her lips. Mark documented everything, adding to his files, building the record that would one day prove useful. In late April, Mark made another set of financial moves. He transferred a significant sum from their joint savings into the account he had opened in Carol's name, then moved that money through 2 more transfers into an account that appeared connected to one of David's shell companies. The trail was complex enough to require investigation, but clear enough to follow. Carol's involvement would seem undeniable. He also began distancing their children from Carol in subtle ways. He volunteered to handle school pickups, scheduled activities that coincided with times Carol usually spent with David, created a pattern where he was the present parent while she was mysteriously absent. Emma and Lucas started turning to him first with questions and problems. Mark was establishing himself as the primary caregiver, building a custody case without anyone realizing it. One evening, Carol came home late and found Mark reading bedtime stories to the children. She stood in the doorway watching, and Mark saw something flicker across her face, perhaps guilt, perhaps longing for a life she had chosen to betray. She thanked him for covering for her and said her dinner with girlfriends had run long. Mark smiled and said he was happy to help, that he loved spending time with the kids. He watched her walk away and felt nothing but the cold certainty of coming justice. The waiting would end soon. David's world was about to collapse, and Carol would be dragged down with him. Mark had built the machine, set it in motion, and now he simply had to let it run. The destruction of his enemies was not a matter of if, but when. And when that moment came, he would be standing there with open arms, ready to catch Carol as she fell, ready to play the devastated husband who had been deceived by everyone he trusted, ready to take everything. The morning David Mitchell's life ended, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was the kind of May morning that made people believe in fresh starts and second chances. David arrived at Hartwell Investment Group at 8:15, coffee in hand, planning to review quarterly reports before his 10 o'clock meeting. He never made it to that meeting. By 9:30, he was in handcuffs, and by noon, his name was scrolling across local news channels as the latest face of white-collar crime in central Ohio. Mark learned about the arrest from a text message sent by a mutual friend. FBI raids investment firm, it said. David arrested. Can you believe it? Mark stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back a response full of shock and disbelief. He asked if anyone knew what the charges were. He expressed concern for David's family. He played his part perfectly, as he had been playing it for 8 months. The news spread through their social circle like wildfire through dry grass. Friends called friends who called other friends. By mid-afternoon, the details were emerging. Securities fraud, insider trading, wire fraud, money laundering. The investigation had apparently been going on for months. Agents had seized computers, files, financial records. They had frozen accounts and interviewed employees. David's business partner was cooperating with prosecutors. Mark left work early, telling his assistant there was a family emergency. He drove home through streets that seemed sharper and more vivid than usual, every detail heightened by the adrenaline of success. His plan had worked. The machine he had built was running exactly as designed. Now he just needed to wait for the next domino to fall. Carol was not home when he arrived. The children were still at school. Mark sat in the quiet living room and turned on the news, watching reporters stand outside David's office building, describing the morning's events with barely contained excitement. White-collar crime made for compelling television, especially when the accused was a respected member of the community with a beautiful home and a seemingly perfect life. The front door burst open at 4:17. Carol stood in the entrance, her face pale, her hands shaking, her eyes wild with a terror Mark had never seen before. She ran to him and collapsed into his arms, sobbing words he could barely understand. David arrested. FBI. Money. Her name. Questions. She did not know what was happening. She did not understand. Mark held her and stroked her hair and asked her to slow down. to tell him everything from the beginning. He kept his voice calm, concerned, the voice of a husband trying to help his wife through a crisis. Carol choked out the story between sobs. Agents had called her that afternoon. They wanted to interview her about financial transactions. They mentioned account numbers she did not recognize. They asked about her relationship with David Mitchell. She looked up at Mark with desperate eyes and swore she did not know anything about David's business. She said she barely understood what he did for a living. Mark nodded and held her tighter, telling her everything would be all right, telling her they would figure this out together. Inside, he felt the cold satisfaction of a hunter watching prey walk into a trap. That evening, Mark made dinner while Carol sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. The children sensed something was wrong, but did not ask questions. After they went to bed, Carol finally told Mark about the affair. She confessed everything, crying so hard she could barely speak, begging for his forgiveness. She said it had been a terrible mistake. She said she loved Mark and only Mark. She said David had pursued her, flattered her, made her feel things she thought she had lost. Mark listened to every word. He let the silence stretch after she finished, let her twist in the agony of uncertainty. Then he took her hands and told her he was hurt, deeply hurt, but that he loved her too much to abandon her now, not when she needed him most, not when forces beyond her control were threatening to destroy everything. He told her they would face this together, as a family. Carol wept with gratitude and relief. She had expected rage, accusations, perhaps even violence. Instead, she found forgiveness and support. She told Mark he was the best man she had ever known. She promised she would spend the rest of her life making this up to him. Mark held her and said nothing, his eyes fixed on a point beyond her shoulder, his mind already moving to the next phase of his plan. The most effective lies are the ones wrapped in truth. Mark Henderson understood this principle better than most. When he suggested that Carol hire Thomas Whitmore as her defense attorney, he presented the recommendation with perfect sincerity. Whitmore was a former federal prosecutor, he explained. The man knew how these investigations worked from the inside. He had connections, experience, a reputation for getting results. What Mark did not mention was that he had already met with Whitmore 3 times, that he had paid a retainer of $50,000 in cash, and that Whitmore understood exactly what was expected of him. The first meeting between Carol and her new attorney took place in Whitmore's downtown office, a space designed to project competence and authority. Dark wood, leather chairs, diplomas and awards covering the walls. Mark accompanied Carol, playing the supportive spouse, holding her hand as Whitmore explained the situation with grave professionalism. The federal investigation had uncovered financial connections between David's fraudulent schemes and accounts bearing Carol's name. Whitmore spread documents across his desk, showing transactions, transfers, shell company registrations. Carol's signature appeared on several forms. Her social security number was attached to accounts she swore she had never opened. The evidence suggested she had been an active participant in laundering the proceeds of David's crimes. Carol protested her innocence with increasing desperation. She had never seen these accounts. She had never signed these documents. Someone must have used her identity without her knowledge. Whitmore nodded sympathetically and said that would be their defense strategy. Identity theft, forgery, an innocent woman caught up in her lover's criminal enterprise. It was plausible. It was even partially true, but proving it would be difficult. Mark watched this performance with hidden admiration. Whitmore was good. He projected concern and competence while carefully steering Carol toward decisions that would ultimately harm her case. He suggested strategies that seemed reasonable but contained fatal flaws. He recommended patience when urgency was required, and action when waiting would have been wiser. Over the following weeks, Whitmore became Carol's primary advisor and confidant. He called her regularly with updates, met with her to review documents, assured her that he was building a strong defense. Mark attended some of these meetings, but not all, establishing a pattern of supportive but not obsessive involvement. He asked questions that seemed helpful, but actually provided Whitmore with information about Carol's vulnerabilities and fears. The prosecution built its case methodically. They traced money through the labyrinth of accounts Mark had created, following each transfer until it led to Carol. They interviewed bank employees who remembered a man matching Mark's description opening accounts in Carol's name, but the descriptions were vague, the memories uncertain. No one connected the helpful husband to the financial crimes his wife supposedly committed. David, facing overwhelming evidence, began cooperating with prosecutors. He provided information about everyone he had worked with, everyone who had known about his schemes. He mentioned Carol's name, not as a co-conspirator, but as someone who had been present during conversations, someone who might have overheard things. It was not much, but it added another thread to the web tightening around her. Mark played his role flawlessly throughout this period. He comforted Carol after difficult meetings with Whitmore. He managed the household while she was consumed by legal preparations. He explained to Emma and Lucas that their mother was dealing with a complicated situation at work, nothing for them to worry about. He became the family's anchor, the calm center of a storm that he himself had created. One night, Carol found Mark sitting alone in the dark living room. She asked what he was thinking about. He told her he was thinking about how much he loved her, how he would do anything to protect their family. Carol started crying and said she did not deserve him. Mark pulled her close and said she deserved everything good in the world. And over her shoulder, invisible in the darkness, he smiled. Every investigation has a turning point, a moment when scattered evidence coalesces into an undeniable pattern. For the case against Carol Henderson, that moment came on a humid August afternoon when forensic accountants finally unraveled the complete money trail. What they found painted a picture of calculated criminal participation that would prove nearly impossible to explain away. The prosecutors called an emergency meeting with Thomas Whitmore. They laid out their findings with the confidence of people holding winning cards. 17 separate transactions over 8 months. Funds moving from accounts connected to David's fraud through shell companies and into accounts bearing Carol's name. Signatures that matched her known handwriting. Digital records showing the accounts had been accessed from IP addresses linked to her home network. Whitmore listened with appropriate gravity and promised to review the evidence with his client. What he did not do was challenge the methodology, question the chain of custody, or identify the glaring inconsistencies that a competent defense attorney would have immediately spotted. The IP addresses, for example, came from the home network, but any device connected to that network would show the same address. Mark's laptop, the one he used for his legitimate work, could easily have been the source. Carol received the news in Whitmore's office the following day. She sat in stunned silence as her attorney explained that the prosecution's case had strengthened considerably. He recommended they begin discussing plea options. A guilty plea to lesser charges might result in a reduced sentence. Fighting the case at trial was becoming increasingly risky. Mark was not present for this meeting. Whitmore had suggested that Carol needed to process this information privately before discussing it with her husband. In truth, Mark had instructed Whitmore to deliver the worst possible assessment without the moderating influence of a supportive spouse. He wanted Carol to feel isolated, desperate, ready to accept whatever advice her attorney provided. That evening, Carol came home looking like she had aged 10 years. She told Mark what Whitmore had said, her voice flat, defeated. Mark expressed outrage. He said Whitmore was being too pessimistic. He insisted they get a second opinion. But Carol shook her head. Whitmore knew the federal system. Whitmore had connections. Whitmore was their best chance. She was going to follow his advice. Mark argued gently for appearance's sake, then relented. He said he would support whatever decision she made. He said he trusted her judgment. He said they would get through this together, no matter what happened. Carol thanked him, and went upstairs to bed. Mark stayed in the kitchen, drinking coffee, running through the remaining steps of his plan. The indictment came in September, almost exactly 1 year after Mark had discovered those first messages on Carol's phone. She was charged with money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The maximum sentence for all charges combined was 23 years. Whitmore assured Carol that she would not receive anywhere near the maximum, but even 5 years would be devastating. Mark hired a nanny to help with the children during the trial preparations. He explained to Emma and Lucas that their mother was going through something difficult, that she needed their love and support. The children, now 13 and 10, understood more than their parents realized. They could feel the tension in the house, the weight of unspoken things pressing down on every conversation. Carol's sister Linda came to visit during this period. She held Carol while she cried and promised that everything would work out. Mark watched the two sisters from across the room, his face arranged in an expression of concern and solidarity. Linda caught his eye and smiled sadly, a smile that contained secrets Carol would not discover for another 3 years. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tension. Carol Henderson sat at the defense table in a navy blue suit that Whitmore had selected to project innocence and professionalism. Her hands were folded in front of her, perfectly still, though Mark could see the faint tremor in her shoulders. The jury filed in, 12 strangers who would decide whether she spent the next several years behind bars or returned home to her children. Mark sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the defense table, where Carol could turn and see his supportive presence whenever she needed reassurance. He had taken leave from work to attend every day of the trial. He had arranged for the children to stay with Carol's parents during the proceedings. He had done everything a devoted husband would do, and he had done it with flawless consistency. The prosecution opened with a devastating presentation: charts showing money flows, documents with Carol's signature, testimony from bank employees and forensic accountants. The Assistant United States Attorney spoke with the calm authority of someone presenting incontrovertible facts. Carol Henderson had participated in a scheme to launder the proceeds of securities fraud. The evidence was clear. The paper trail was undeniable. Whitmore's opening statement was competent but uninspired. He suggested that Carol had been manipulated by David Mitchell, that her signatures had been forged, that she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. He promised the jury would hear evidence of her good character, her devotion to her family, her complete lack of financial sophistication. It was a reasonable defense. It was also fatally incomplete. The trial proceeded over 2 weeks. Prosecution witnesses established the mechanics of David's fraud and the money laundering operation that had cleaned his illegal profits. Defense witnesses, friends, and family members testified to Carol's honesty and integrity. Expert witnesses argued over handwriting analysis and digital forensics. Through it all, Mark watched and waited and played his part. Whitmore made mistakes that only a trained legal eye would notice. He failed to object to hearsay testimony that painted Carol in a negative light. He introduced character witnesses in an order that diminished their impact. He asked questions on cross-examination that allowed prosecution witnesses to strengthen their testimony. Each error was small, deniable, the kind of thing that could be attributed to strategy rather than sabotage. Carol testified in her own defense on the 9th day. Whitmore had prepared her carefully, rehearsing answers to anticipated questions, coaching her on how to present herself to the jury. She told her story with apparent sincerity, denying any knowledge of David's crimes, expressing horror at the discovery that her identity had been used for illegal purposes. She cried when describing the impact on her family. She looked at the jury with desperate hope. The cross-examination was brutal. The prosecutor walked Carol through document after document, forcing her to deny each signature, each account, each transaction. He highlighted inconsistencies in her testimony, moments when her answers did not quite align with physical evidence. He suggested that her relationship with David Mitchell went beyond friendship, that she had been motivated by love and loyalty to help him hide his crimes. Mark watched his wife crumble on the stand. He saw the jury's faces harden with skepticism. He observed the precise moment when the tide turned against her, when the presumption of innocence gave way to the assumption of guilt, and he felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a plan executing perfectly. The closing arguments came on day 11. The prosecution summarized the evidence with surgical precision. Whitmore gave an emotional appeal for reasonable doubt that felt hollow after the damage done during the trial. The jury retired to deliberate. Carol returned to the defense table and reached back to grip Mark's hand. He squeezed gently and told her to have faith. 3 days. That is how long Carol Henderson spent in a purgatory of uncertainty, waiting for 12 strangers to decide her fate. She barely slept. She could not eat. She walked through the house like a ghost, touching objects as if seeing them for the last time. Mark stayed close, attentive, murmuring reassurances that neither of them believed. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. The jury had reached a verdict. Carol and Mark drove to the courthouse in silence, her hand gripping his so tightly her knuckles turned white. Whitmore met them in the hallway, his expression carefully neutral. He said juries were unpredictable. He said anything could happen. He did not say that he had done his job, that the outcome had been determined months ago in a private office with cash on the table. The courtroom filled with the same faces that had populated it for 2 weeks. Journalists, curious observers, a few friends who had maintained their support despite the accusations. Carol's parents sat in the back row, her mother clutching a rosary, her father staring straight ahead with hollow eyes. Mark took his usual seat directly behind his wife. The judge called the court to order and asked the jury foreperson to stand. The woman, a middle-aged accountant from the suburbs, rose with a folded paper in her hands. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The woman said they had. The judge asked the defendant to rise. Carol stood on trembling legs. Whitmore stood beside her. Mark leaned forward, close enough to touch his wife's shoulder, but choosing to keep his hands folded in his lap. The foreperson read the verdict in a flat, official voice. Count 1, money laundering, guilty. Count 2, wire fraud, guilty. Count 3, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, guilty. Carol made a sound like an animal in pain. Her legs buckled, and Whitmore caught her, lowering her back into her chair. Behind her, Mark rose and reached over the barrier to grip her shoulders, his face contorted with shock and grief that anyone watching would have believed completely. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later and ordered Carol remanded to custody pending that hearing. Federal marshals approached the defense table with handcuffs. Carol turned to look at Mark, her face streaming with tears, her mouth forming words that would not come. He told her he loved her. He told her he would fight for her. He told her this was not over. The marshals led Carol away through a side door. Mark watched her go, watched the door close behind her, watched the last moment of his old life disappear into the institutional machinery of the federal justice system. Then he sat down, buried his face in his hands, and waited for the courtroom to empty. Whitmore approached him after everyone else had left. The attorney's face held no expression as he asked if there was anything else he needed. Mark looked up with red-rimmed eyes and said no. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Whitmore nodded once and walked away, his obligation fulfilled, his secret safe. Mark drove home alone through streets washed gold by the setting sun. He stopped at a grocery store and bought flowers for the kitchen table. He picked up the children from their grandparents' house and told them their mother would be away for a while but that everything would be okay. He made them dinner and helped with homework and tucked them into bed. Then he sat in the dark living room with a glass of whiskey and allowed himself, for the first time in over a year, to feel something other than cold calculation. It was not joy. It was not triumph. It was something closer to exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had completed an impossible task. Carol would be sentenced within weeks. David was already facing 12 years. Mark had won. 6 weeks later, Carol stood before the judge to learn her fate. She had lost weight in jail. Her hair had dulled. The light in her eyes had gone out. The judge spoke about the seriousness of financial crimes, about the importance of accountability, about the need to send a message. Then he sentenced Carol Henderson to 4 years in federal prison. Mark was there to hear it. He stood in his usual spot, wearing his usual expression of devastated support. When the marshals led Carol away for the final time, she looked back at him with something that might have been love, might have been gratitude, might have been the last flicker of trust from a woman who did not yet understand that her husband was the architect of her destruction. How quickly can a life be erased? How fast can someone disappear from the daily rhythms of a family, a community, a world? For Carol Henderson, the answer was measured in weeks. Within 6 weeks of her conviction, her husband had filed for divorce. Within 8 weeks, he had been granted full custody of their children. Within 3 months, her name had become something people whispered rather than spoke aloud, a cautionary tale about the wages of sin and the consequences of poor choices. Mark moved through the legal proceedings with the efficiency of a man who had planned every step. His divorce attorney, a shark named Patricia Vance, who specialized in high-asset separations, argued that Carol's criminal conviction demonstrated moral unfitness for parental responsibility. The family court judge, presented with a federal fraud conviction and a 4-year prison sentence, had little choice but to agree. Mark received the house, primary custody of Emma and Lucas, and the majority of their remaining assets after the government seizures. He sold the story of the betrayed husband with the same skill he had demonstrated throughout his campaign of revenge. Friends rallied around him. Colleagues expressed sympathy. His employer granted him flexible hours to manage his suddenly single-parent household. Mark Henderson became a figure of admiration, a man who had stood by his wife through her trial only to discover the depth of her betrayal afterward. The children struggled with their mother's absence. Emma, now 13, withdrew into silence and books. Lucas, 10, acted out at school and started having nightmares. Mark handled both with patient attention, attending parent-teacher conferences, arranging therapy sessions, being present in ways that Carol never could have been even before her arrest. He was building a case for permanent custody, a record of devoted fatherhood that would withstand any future challenge. Carol wrote letters from prison, long, desperate letters filled with apologies and explanations and pleas for forgiveness. Mark read them all carefully, then told the children that their mother needed time to focus on her rehabilitation. He did not prevent contact entirely, that would have looked suspicious, but he managed it, controlled it, ensured that Carol's influence over her children diminished with each passing month. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Mark received a promotion at work. The company valued stability, and Mark had demonstrated remarkable stability in the face of personal catastrophe. His new position came with a significant raise and a corner office with windows overlooking the city. He celebrated quietly, alone in his house after the children had gone to bed, with a glass of expensive scotch and the satisfaction of total victory. He began dating again after a year. Nothing serious at first, just dinners and occasional events that required a companion. The women he chose were appropriate, professional, understanding of his complicated situation. None of them lasted more than a few months. Mark was not looking for love. He was looking for appearances, for the final pieces of the respectable life he was constructing from the wreckage of his marriage. Carol's parents visited the children every few weeks, supervised by Mark with careful attention to boundaries. They looked at him with expressions he could not quite read, gratitude mixed with something darker. They had lost their daughter to prison and their grandchildren to a man who seemed almost too perfect. But they had no evidence of anything wrong, no reason to suspect that Mark was anything other than what he appeared to be. David Mitchell, meanwhile, had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His wife had divorced him immediately after his arrest. His assets had been seized. His reputation had been destroyed. Mark occasionally thought about his former best friend, rotting in a cell somewhere, paying for crimes that were real, but also for a betrayal that Mark had punished far more severely than any court could have. The balance sheet was complete. Mark had taken everything from both of them, his wife and his best friend, who had conspired to humiliate him. He had done it legally, methodically, invisibly. No one would ever know the truth. He would live out his days as a respected professional, a devoted father, a man who had overcome tremendous adversity. The perfect mask had become his permanent face. Federal Correctional Institution, Alderson, sits in the mountains of West Virginia, a collection of brick buildings surrounded by hills that turn gold in autumn and white in winter. It was here that Carol Henderson spent 3 years of her life, and it was here that she slowly transformed from a broken woman into something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous. The first year was the worst. Carol moved through the days in a fog of grief and confusion, unable to understand how her life had collapsed so completely. She attended mandatory counseling sessions where she repeated her innocence to therapists who had heard the same claims from 1,000 other inmates. She worked in the prison library, shelving books with trembling hands, avoiding the eyes of women who had committed crimes she could not even imagine. Mark brought the children to visit twice during that first year. The visits took place in a sterile room with guards watching, conversations limited to approved topics. Emma sat rigid and silent, barely looking at her mother. Lucas cried and asked when she was coming home. Carol held them as long as the guards allowed and then watched them leave with their father, the man she still believed had stood by her through everything. Letters became her lifeline. She wrote to Mark every week, pouring out her heart, begging him to believe in her innocence, promising that she would make everything right when she was released. His responses were brief and non-committal. He was busy with work. The children were doing well. He hoped she was focusing on her rehabilitation. Each letter felt colder than the last, but Carol told herself it was the difficulty of maintaining a relationship through prison walls. The second year brought clarity. Without the chaos of the trial and the shock of conviction, Carol began to think more carefully about what had happened to her. She requested copies of her case files and spent hours in the library studying them. She learned about federal sentencing guidelines, about the elements of the crimes she had supposedly committed, about the evidence that had been used to convict her. Something did not add up. The financial transactions that formed the core of the prosecution's case had begun months before her affair with David had started. The accounts in her name had been opened at a time when she could not have known David was involved in anything illegal. The timeline was wrong. The logic was wrong. But her attorney had never raised these issues at trial. Carol began researching Thomas Whitmore. She found articles about his career as a prosecutor, his transition to defense work, his reputation for plea bargains rather than trials. She also found, buried in legal blogs and bar association reports, references to ethics complaints filed against him in other cases. Clients who felt they had been poorly represented. Allegations of conflicts of interest. Nothing proven, nothing actionable, but a pattern that made Carol's skin crawl. The third year was when Carol started taking notes. She created a timeline of her marriage, her affair, the investigation, the trial. She marked inconsistencies and questions. She wrote down everything she remembered about Mark's behavior during that period, the attentiveness that had seemed loving at the time, but now felt like something else entirely. She did not yet suspect the full truth, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Her release date approached with the speed of a slow-motion collision. Carol had served 3 years of her 4-year sentence, earning early release through good behavior and program participation. She had no job waiting for her, no home, no money, and a family that had been legally severed from her. The only person who had maintained consistent contact was her sister Linda, who had written faithfully every month and visited whenever she could make the long drive to West Virginia. On the morning of her release, Carol walked through the prison gates carrying a small bag of personal belongings and a head full of questions. Linda was waiting in the parking lot, standing beside her car, looking nervous in a way that Carol did not fully understand. The sisters embraced for a long moment without speaking. Then Linda said there was room in her guest bedroom for as long as Carol needed. Carol thanked her and climbed into the car. As they drove away from Alderson, Carol watched the mountains recede in the side mirror. She was 39 years old. She had lost her husband, her children, her reputation, and 3 years of her life. But she had gained something too. She had gained suspicion. And suspicion, she was beginning to understand, was the first step toward truth. The world outside prison walls moves faster than anyone remembers. Carol Henderson discovered this on her first full day of freedom, standing in a grocery store, overwhelmed by the sheer number of choices in the cereal aisle. 3 years of institutional routine had stripped away her ability to make simple decisions. Everything felt too bright, too loud, too much. Linda's house was a modest ranch home in a suburb of Dayton, about 2 hours from Columbus and the life Carol had once lived. It was far enough to feel like a fresh start, but close enough that Carol could eventually reconnect with her children, if Mark ever allowed it. The guest room was small but clean, with a window that looked out on a bird feeder that attracted cardinals and finches. The first week was devoted to basic necessities. Carol needed identification, since her driver's license had expired during her incarceration. She needed clothes that were not prison-issued. She needed to establish herself as a functioning member of society again, complete with a bank account, a phone, and eventually a job. Linda helped with all of it, patient and supportive, though Carol noticed her sister sometimes looked at her with an expression that seemed almost guilty. Rebuilding a relationship with Emma and Lucas proved more difficult. Mark had agreed to supervised visitation, 2 hours every other Saturday at a neutral location. The first meeting took place at a coffee shop, awkward and painful, with Emma barely speaking and Lucas unable to stop talking. They had grown so much. Emma was 16 now, taller than Carol, with the guarded eyes of a teenager who had learned not to trust. Lucas was 13, gangly and uncertain, caught between childhood loyalty and adolescent embarrassment. Mark dropped them off and picked them up without speaking to Carol beyond necessary logistics. He looked good, she noticed. Healthy, prosperous, comfortable in his skin. He had rebuilt his life completely, while she had been marking time in a concrete box. There was no trace of the devastation she had expected to see in a man whose wife had been convicted of federal crimes. Carol found part-time work at a library, a job Linda had helped arrange through a friend. The pay was minimal, but the work was familiar, and her supervisor did not ask too many questions about the gap in her employment history. She shelved books and helped patrons find what they were looking for, and slowly remembered how to exist in a world that expected competence and reliability. At night, Carol returned to her investigation. She had brought her prison notes with her, pages and pages of questions and timelines and observations. She began requesting records through official channels, copies of financial documents from her divorce, transcripts from her trial, anything that might help her understand what had really happened. The responses came slowly, but they came. Each document added another piece to a puzzle that was gradually taking shape. The money trails were more complex than she had realized, layered through multiple accounts in ways that required significant financial expertise to construct. Carol had never been good with money. She had let Mark handle their finances throughout their marriage. The idea that she could have created these elaborate schemes was absurd to anyone who actually knew her. But someone had created them. Someone had opened accounts in her name, forged her signature, moved money through a maze designed to implicate her. The only person with access to all the necessary information, the social security numbers, the home network, the knowledge of her daily schedule, was Mark. Carol did not want to believe it. The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. But she had learned in prison that wanting something to be false did not make it so. Truth existed independent of desire. And the truth, she was beginning to realize, was that she might have been destroyed not by bad luck or David's criminality, but by the deliberate actions of the man she had married. There is a moment in every investigation when fragments suddenly coalesce into a pattern. For Carol Henderson, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday evening, 3 months after her release, when she finally obtained a complete copy of her trial transcript. She read it straight through, 600 pages, and by the time she finished, her hands were shaking with something that felt like electricity. Thomas Whitmore had sabotaged her defense. It was obvious now, reading with fresh eyes and 3 years of accumulated suspicion. He had failed to object to hearsay evidence that should have been excluded. He had introduced character witnesses in an order that minimized their impact. He had asked questions on cross-examination that actually strengthened the prosecution's case. Each individual error could have been attributed to poor judgment, but together they formed a pattern of deliberate incompetence. Carol began researching legal malpractice. She learned that prisoners sometimes succeeded in overturning convictions based on ineffective assistance of counsel, though the bar was high. She would need to prove not just that Whitmore had made mistakes, but that those mistakes had affected the outcome of the trial. More importantly, she would need to prove that Whitmore had acted deliberately rather than merely incompetently. The connection to Mark remained circumstantial. Carol knew that her husband had recommended Whitmore. She knew that Mark had been present for some meetings, but not others. She knew that Mark had financial expertise and access to her personal information. But knowing and proving were different things. She needed evidence. She started with Whitmore himself. The attorney had faced additional ethics complaints since her trial and had recently surrendered his law license rather than face a formal disciplinary hearing. Carol found his address through public records and wrote him a letter asking for a meeting. She did not expect a response, but 2 weeks later, her phone rang. Whitmore agreed to meet at a diner outside Cincinnati, neutral territory for both of them. He looked older than Carol remembered, grayer and softer, with the defeated posture of a man whose career had collapsed. He ordered coffee and would not meet her eyes. Carol asked him directly, had Mark Henderson paid him to throw her case? Whitmore was silent for a long moment. Then he said he could not answer that question directly, but he suggested that Carol might want to examine the financial records of a certain trust account from the relevant period. He gave her a name, a date, and a reference number. Then he stood, left money for his coffee, and walked out without looking back. It took Carol another month to obtain the records Whitmore had referenced. The trust account belonged to a law firm that had been dissolved shortly after her trial. The records showed a deposit of $50,000, cash, made 3 days before Carol had first met Whitmore. The deposit slip bore no name, but the date corresponded exactly with the period when Mark had been supposedly researching defense attorneys. Carol sat in her sister's guest room with the evidence spread across the bed. She had enough now to file a complaint, maybe enough to request a new trial. But she wanted more. She wanted to understand the full scope of what Mark had done, not just the legal manipulation, but the personal betrayal that had preceded it. She thought about the timeline again. Mark's behavior had changed sometime in the fall, almost a year before David's arrest. He had become more attentive, more present, more devoted. At the time, Carol had attributed it to renewed commitment to their marriage. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. Surveillance, preparation, the careful observation of a predator studying prey. If Mark had known about the affair for that long, he had endured months of deception while constructing his response. The cold patience of that planning was almost incomprehensible. What kind of person could maintain a loving facade while building a trap designed to destroy someone's life? The answer, Carol was beginning to understand, was the kind of person who had been lying from the very beginning. The kind of person whose entire marriage had been a performance. The kind of person who might have secrets of his own, secrets that could shift everything she thought she knew. Some discoveries come like thunderbolts, sudden and undeniable. Others arrive quietly, slipping through cracks in ordinary moments until they can no longer be ignored. Carol's final revelation came on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, 4 months after her release, when she was searching Linda's computer for a document about their mother's estate. Linda had gone to the grocery store, leaving Carol alone in the house. The document Carol needed was somewhere in the cluttered maze of folders on Linda's laptop, and she clicked through directories looking for anything related to family finances. She found tax records, old photographs, recipes saved from websites. And then she found a folder labeled simply with a single letter. M. Carol almost did not open it. The folder could have contained anything: medical records, mortgage documents, miscellaneous files. But something made her click, some instinct she could not name. The folder contained hundreds of files, photographs, emails, text conversations saved as documents. Carol opened one at random. The email was from Mark. It was dated 4 years earlier, months before Carol had started her affair with David. The subject line said simply, "Tonight." The body of the message contained an address, a time, and 3 words that stopped Carol's heart. "I love you." She opened another email, and another, and another. They stretched back over years, a secret correspondence between her husband and her sister that predated everything Carol thought she knew about her marriage. The photographs were worse. Mark and Linda together in hotels, on beaches, at restaurants Carol had never seen, smiling, touching, looking at each other with an intimacy that Carol had believed belonged only to her. The timeline reconstructed itself in Carol's mind with horrible clarity. Mark and Linda had been together for at least 6 years, based on the oldest files in the folder. Their affair had begun when Emma was 10 and Lucas was 7. It had continued through family holidays, through shared dinners, through all the occasions when Mark and Linda had been in the same room with Carol between them, performing normalcy while sharing a secret that made a mockery of everything. Mark had not destroyed Carol's life because she had an affair with David. He had destroyed her life because he wanted out of their marriage without losing his children, his house, his reputation. He had wanted Linda, and he had found a way to get everything he wanted while punishing Carol for sins that were no greater than his own. Carol heard Linda's car pull into the driveway. She did not close the laptop. She did not move from the desk. She sat perfectly still, feeling the last illusions of her life crumble into dust, waiting for her sister to walk through the door. Linda entered carrying grocery bags, calling out a greeting that died in her throat when she saw Carol's face. The sisters stared at each other across the kitchen. Linda's gaze went to the laptop screen, still displaying one of the photographs, and all the color drained from her face. Carol spoke first. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. She said she had found the folder. She said she had seen everything. She asked Linda how long she had been sleeping with Mark, and Linda started crying before she could answer. The confession came in pieces, broken by sobs and pleas for forgiveness. Linda said it had started accidentally, a moment of weakness that became an addiction. She said Mark had promised to leave Carol, had promised they would be together eventually. She said she had never meant for any of this to happen. She said she was sorry, so sorry, sorrier than Carol could ever understand. Carol listened without expression. She learned that Mark and Linda still saw each other regularly. She learned that they had plans to marry once enough time had passed. She learned that her sister had known about Mark's scheme to frame Carol, had known about the corrupted attorney, had known everything and said nothing while Carol rotted in a prison cell for crimes she did not commit. When Linda finished, Carol stood slowly. She looked at her sister, at the woman who had held her hand through the worst moments of her life while secretly being the cause of them. She said she would be out of the house within the hour, Linda begged her to stay, to talk, to let her explain. Carol walked past her without another word and began packing her few belongings. She had come to Linda's house seeking refuge and had found the final piece of a puzzle she had not known she was solving. Her marriage had been a lie from both sides. Her imprisonment had been orchestrated by the two people she had trusted most. And now, finally, she had everything she needed. The question was no longer what had happened. The question was what she was going to do about it. The truth is a weapon that cuts both ways. It can destroy, but it can also liberate. Carol Henderson spent 3 days after leaving Linda's house in a cheap motel outside Dayton, surrounded by documents and photographs and the accumulated evidence of 2 betrayals that had defined her life. She did not sleep much. She did not eat much. She planned. Linda called 17 times. Each call went to voicemail. The messages progressed from desperate apology to frantic pleading to something that sounded almost like threats. Linda begged Carol not to do anything rash. Linda said they could work this out as a family. Linda said Mark would be furious if he found out Carol knew the truth. Carol listened to each message once, then deleted it. On the 4th day, Carol drove back to Linda's house. Her sister answered the door looking like she had not slept since Carol left, her eyes red and swollen, her hair unwashed. Carol walked past her without greeting and sat down at the kitchen table. She placed a folder on the surface between them and told Linda to sit. The folder contained printouts of the emails and photographs Carol had found. It contained the financial records showing the payment to Thomas Whitmore. It contained the timeline Carol had constructed, showing how Mark's affair with Linda had preceded everything, how his revenge against Carol had been not justice, but calculated elimination of an obstacle. Carol told Linda she had 2 choices. The first was to tell Carol everything, every detail of her relationship with Mark, every conversation about the scheme to frame Carol, every plan they had made for their future together. The second choice was for Carol to take this evidence to an attorney and begin the process of overturning her conviction, a process that would inevitably expose Linda's role in the conspiracy. Linda chose to talk. The story came out in fragments over the next 2 hours. Linda described how the affair with Mark had started at a family Christmas party 6 years earlier. She described the secret meetings, the burner phones, the elaborate lies they had both told to maintain their double lives. She described how Mark had confided in her when he discovered Carol's affair with David, how his initial rage had transformed into something cold and purposeful. Mark had told Linda everything. He had explained his plan to expose David's financial crimes, to create evidence implicating Carol, to hire an attorney who would ensure her conviction. Linda had objected at first, had said it was too extreme, had worried about the children. But Mark had convinced her it was the only way. If he simply divorced Carol, he would lose half of everything. She might get custody of the children. His reputation would suffer. This way, he could emerge as the victim, keep everything, and eventually be with Linda without anyone suspecting the truth. Carol asked if Linda had ever considered warning her. Linda looked away and said Mark had promised that Carol would only serve a year or 2. He had said the sentence would be light, that Carol would rebuild her life eventually, that everyone would end up fine. By the time it became clear that Carol would serve longer, Linda felt trapped. Confessing would have meant losing Mark, losing everything they had built together. The justifications sounded hollow even as Linda spoke them. Carol watched her sister's face and saw something she had never noticed before, a weakness at the core, a willingness to sacrifice anyone for the sake of comfort and security. Linda had watched Carol be destroyed and had chosen to remain silent. That silence was its own kind of crime. Carol gathered her documents and stood to leave. Linda grabbed her arm and asked what she was going to do. Carol looked at her sister for a long moment. She said she had not decided yet. She said Linda should probably prepare for several possibilities. Then she walked out of the house and did not look back. The drive to Columbus took 2 hours. Carol spent the time thinking about her children, about Emma and Lucas growing up with a father who was capable of such elaborate cruelty. She thought about the years she had lost, the birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had been stolen from her. She thought about Mark, sitting in the house that had once been hers, living the life that should have been hers, believing that he had won. She checked into a hotel downtown, the same hotel where she and David had once conducted their affair. The irony was not lost on her. She ordered room service and sat by the window, watching the city lights, preparing herself for what came next. Carol had evidence that could potentially overturn her conviction. She had testimony from a disgraced attorney. She had proof of a conspiracy involving her husband and her sister. She could take this to the authorities, hire a new lawyer, begin the long process of seeking justice through official channels. But official channels were slow. Official channels were uncertain. Official channels had failed her once before. Carol had spent 3 years in prison learning patience, but she had also learned something else. She had learned that some forms of justice could not be found in courtrooms. Some forms of justice required a more personal delivery. She made her decision sometime after midnight. She would confront Mark directly. She would show him what she had discovered. She would watch his face as he realized that his perfect crime had been exposed. And then she would decide, based on his reaction, what kind of justice the situation required. The house looked exactly as Carol remembered it. The same red brick facade, the same black shutters, the same Japanese maple in the front yard that she had planted the year Emma was born. 3 years had passed since she had lived here, but the house existed outside of time, preserved in the amber of memory, unchanged while everything else had been transformed. Carol parked across the street and sat in her car for several minutes, watching. It was early evening, the sky fading from blue to orange to purple. Lights were on inside the house. She could see movement through the windows, shadows passing back and forth. Her children were in there. Her former life was in there. And Mark was in there, probably preparing dinner, probably helping with homework, probably performing the role of devoted single father that he had crafted from the destruction of her existence. She had copies of all her evidence in a folder on the passenger seat. She had backups stored in 3 different locations, electronic and physical, insurance against whatever might happen in the next hour. She had called a lawyer that morning and scheduled an appointment for the following week. She had prepared for every contingency she could imagine, but preparation could only take you so far. At some point, you had to act. Carol crossed the street and walked up the path she had walked 1,000 times before. The flowers in the beds were different now, someone else's choices, but the stepping stones were the same ones she had selected at the garden center 8 years ago. She reached the front door and paused with her hand raised. The last time she had been at this door, she had been in handcuffs, collecting a few personal items before being transferred to begin her sentence. Mark had stood beside her with tears in his eyes, promising to wait for her, promising to fight for her freedom, promising lies that she had believed, because believing them was easier than facing the alternative. Carol pressed the doorbell. She heard it chime inside, the same 2-tone melody it had always played. Footsteps approached. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Mark stood in the entrance, wearing an apron dusted with flour, clearly in the middle of cooking. His expression went through several transformations in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, concern, and then something that looked almost like fear before he managed to compose his features into neutral politeness. He said Carol's name as if it were a question. He asked what she was doing here. He said the custody agreement specified supervised visitation only. He asked if something was wrong. Carol did not answer immediately. She studied his face, this face she had loved for 18 years, this face that had smiled at her and lied to her and planned her destruction with patient malice. She thought about all the nights she had lain beside him, trusting him, while he carried on with her sister. She thought about the courtroom and the verdict and the cold metal of handcuffs closing around her wrists. She thought about the cell and the years and the slow reconstruction of herself from the wreckage he had created. And then Carol smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a forgiving smile. It was the same cold, calculating smile that Mark had worn on the night he first discovered her messages with David. The smile of someone who has been terribly wronged and has finally found the means to balance the scales. Mark recognized that smile. She could see it in the way his face went pale, the way his hand tightened on the doorframe, the way his eyes darted to the folder she carried. He knew, in that instant, that his perfect crime had come unraveled. He knew that the woman standing before him was not the broken ex-wife he had discarded, but something else entirely. Carol spoke at last. Her voice was calm, conversational, almost pleasant. She said, "Hello, Mark. We need to talk about Linda." The color drained from his face completely. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. Behind him, somewhere in the house, one of the children called out asking who was at the door. Mark did not answer. He could not answer. He stood frozen in the doorway of the life he had stolen, facing the woman he had destroyed, watching his carefully constructed world begin to collapse around him. Carol held up the folder. She said she had evidence. She said she had testimony. She said she had everything she needed to reopen her case and expose what he and Linda had done. She said Mark had two choices, and she was interested to hear which one he would select. The door remained open between them, a threshold between past and future, between the lies that had defined their marriage and the truth that would define whatever came next. Mark stood on one side, trapped by his own cruelty. Carol stood on the other, transformed by her suffering into something he had never anticipated. She had entered that house 17 years ago as a young bride full of hope and trust. She had left it 3 years ago as a convicted criminal, broken and bewildered. She stood at its door now as neither of those women, but as something new, something forged in prison cells and sleepless nights, and the terrible clarity of complete betrayal. The sun had fully set now. The street was quiet. The neighbors had no idea that inside this ordinary house, in this ordinary suburb, a reckoning was finally beginning. Carol waited for Mark to speak, to explain, to beg, to threaten. She had waited 3 years. She could wait a few moments more. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The cold smile that Mark had worn when he began his revenge now belonged to someone else, and she had no intention of giving it back. Well, another story has come to its logical conclusion. This story makes us think about how thin the line is between justice and revenge, and what price we are willing to pay to restore violated justice. Mark Henderson considered himself a victim of betrayal, and formally, he was right. His wife was cheating on him with his best friend. But his response to this betrayal transformed him from a victim into a criminal, and one far more dangerous than those he was punishing. Carol made a mistake by giving in to the temptation of an affair. But did this mistake really deserve 3 years in prison, the loss of her children, and a destroyed life? The most terrible thing in this story is the hypocrisy. Mark himself had been cheating on his wife for 6 years, meeting with her own sister. He had no moral right to judge Carol, but he used her transgression as a weapon to achieve his own goals. This is a classic example of how a person sees the speck in another's eye, but fails to notice the log in his own. This story teaches us several important things. First, revenge is a poison that primarily poisons the one who takes it. Mark spent a year of his life destroying another person. He turned into a cold manipulator, capable of calmly kissing his wife goodnight while knowing he was preparing her destruction. What price did he pay for this victory? He lost his own humanity. Second, lies and betrayal have a tendency to come back around. Mark thought he had created the perfect crime, but he didn't account for the human factor. Linda's foolishness in leaving compromising materials, Whitmore's conscience deciding to make at least some amends. Sooner or later, the truth comes out. And the more complex the scheme of deception, the more dramatic its collapse. Third, Revenge never brings the satisfaction one expects from it. At the end of the story, Mark feels no triumph, only exhaustion. Because destroying another person doesn't heal your own wounds, it only creates new ones. True strength lies in the ability to forgive and move forward, preserving dignity and humanity. Take care of yourselves, my friends, and with that, I bid you farewell.